The air in the grand house was thick with the scent of magnolias and decay, a cloying sweetness that clung to the back of the throat. Master Alistair, a man whose gaunt frame seemed carved from the very live oak that shaded his property, stood on the veranda, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance where his fields of cotton bled into the horizon. Inside, in a room heavy with velvet and the smell of camphor, lay his daughter, Eleanor. She was a creature of immense proportions, her body a vast, pale landscape confined to a reinforced bed, her breath a constant, labored wheeze that filled the silence. The doctor from Charleston had thrown up his hands, speaking of humors and blockages, of a constitution fundamentally broken. Desperation, a cold and sharp-edged thing, had taken root in Alistair's heart, festering alongside his dwindling fortune and the shame of his daughter's condition. It was this desperation that led his gaze to fall upon the man known as Isaiah. Isaiah was a slave, but he was also something else. He was the son and grandson of men and women stolen from a land where knowledge of the earth and the body was as common as the air. This knowledge was a quiet, dangerous thing, passed down in whispers between the rows of cotton, in the stolen moments of night. He was a bonesetter, an herb man, a person who understood the flow of life in a way the Charleston doctor did not. Alistair, in his supreme arrogance, saw not a man of profound skill, but a tool, a resource from his own land to be utilized. He summoned Isaiah to the great house, the command a crack of thunder in the oppressive stillness. The journey from the sweltering rose to the cool, shadowed interior of the house was a passage between two worlds. Isaiah's feet, bare and cracked, made no sound on the polished floors. He was a man of quiet strength, his own body lean and hardened by a life of unending labor, a stark contrast to the stagnant helplessness that enveloped Eleanor's room. He entered, his eyes taking in the scene without judgment, without the revulsion the white maids could not fully conceal. He saw a person, a human spirit trapped in a prison of its own flesh. Alistair's offer was not a request, it was a transaction spoken in the cold language of ownership. "Fix her," he had said, his voice like dry gravel. "You have your ways. Use them, succeed, and your burdens will be lighter." The unspoken thread of failure hung heavier than any promise. Isaiah nodded, a slow, deliberate dip of his head. He knew the precariousness of his position. To fail was to invite punishment, perhaps death. To succeed too well was to become a permanent, prized possession, a different kind of chain. But he looked at Eleanor, at the profound misery in her eyes, and something in him, a healer's instinct older than slavery itself, responded. The first touch was a shock to both of them. Isaiah's hands, calloused and strong, were gentle as they began their assessment. He did not see mere fat, he felt the story her body told. He felt the sluggish circulation, the water retention that made her skin taut and shiny, the painful inflammation in her joints. He ignored the gasps of the hovering maid, ignored the way Eleanor flinched, her entire being conditioned to see his touch as a violation. He spoke to her then, his voice a low, resonant murmur, so different from the clipped tones of her father or the simpering pity of the servants. "This will not be quick," he said. "It will not be easy. Your body must be reminded how to live." His methods were a mystery, a quiet rebellion against the established order. He began by refusing the rich, heavy foods that were brought to her on silver trays. Instead, he prepared broths from wild greens and roots he gathered himself, bitter concoctions that he insisted would cleanse her from within. He introduced subtle movements, first just the flexing of a finger, the rotation of a wrist, exercises so small they seemed pointless to the observers but were monumental to a body that had not moved in years. He would spend hours simply manipulating her hands and feet, his fingers working with a precise, knowing pressure, stimulating points that, according to his ancestors, governed the flow of energy through the body. Eleanor, who had long since retreated into the fortress of her own mind, began to feel strange stirrings. The constant, aching pain in her knees began to recede, not entirely, but enough to be noticeable. The fog of lethargy that had clouded her thoughts began to thin. She started to watch him, this silent, powerful man who treated her not as a monster or a disappointment, but as a complex system that had fallen into disrepair. Her fear began to curdle into a desperate, fragile curiosity. She had never been touched with such purposeful, clinical care. It was neither the repulsed distance of her father nor the condescending pats of the maids. Weeks turned into a strange, suspended season. Isaiah's presence in the house became a fixed point, a quiet anomaly. He would arrive at dawn, his basket filled with plants, and work until the light faded. He taught her to breathe deeply, filling parts of her lungs she had forgotten existed. He used warm stones wrapped in cloth, placing them along her spine, explaining in his quiet way that it was to melt the cold that had settled in her bones. He created poultices from clay and herbs that drew the inflammation from her swollen limbs. The changes were infinitesimal at first, then gradual, then undeniable. The wheezing in her chest softened. The alarming tightness in her skin began to ease as the excess water left her body. A strange and unspoken alliance formed between the healer and the patient. Eleanor, who had never been given agency over anything, least of all her own body, began to participate. She would force herself to complete the small exercises when he was not there, a private act of defiance against her own helplessness. She started to ask questions, her voice, long unused, a rusty instrument. "What is this root for?" she would ask. "Why does pressing there ease the ache in my head?" Isaiah answered her honestly, sharing slivers of a knowledge that was his only true inheritance, a knowledge his ancestors had paid for in blood. Master Alistair watched from a distance, his desperation slowly being replaced by a cold, calculating satisfaction. He saw the physical transformation, the reduction in her monumental size, the return of a faint glow to her cheeks, the fact that she could now sit up in her bed without assistance. He saw it as a validation of his own power, proof that even the most broken of his possessions could be restored through the application of his will and his property. He never once thanked Isaiah, he merely noted the progress in his ledger of concerns, a problem being efficiently managed. But what was happening in that room was far more profound than a simple physical reduction. Isaiah was not just treating her obesity, he was healing a soul crushed by neglect and shame. He spoke to her of the land, of the cycles of the moon and the seasons, of things that were real and enduring, a world away from the brittle social conventions that had defined her life. In turn, Eleanor, for the first time, saw a black man not as part of the scenery of her life, but as an individual, a person of depth, intelligence, and immense, quiet power. The foundational prejudices of her upbringing began to crack and crumble under the weight of this simple, sustained human interaction. The work was arduous. There were days of setback and pain, days when Eleanor wept with frustration, convinced it was all for nothing. On these days, Isaiah did not coddle her or offer false platitudes. He simply waited, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of her emotions, and then quietly resumed the work. His patience was a boundless, powerful force. He was remapping her body, teaching her nerves to feel something other than pain, teaching her muscles the memory of movement. He showed her how to massage her own limbs, to take ownership of her own physical self. The other slaves on the plantation watched this dynamic with a mixture of hope and terror. They knew Isaiah's value, and they knew the capricious cruelty of the master. His success made him visible, and visibility for a slave was a dangerous thing. They whispered prayers to gods their masters couldn't comprehend, asking for protection for the healer who walked so perilously close to the big house. They also saw the change in the missus, not just in her body, but in her eyes. The haughty, defeated glare was gone, replaced by a watchful, learning light. After 3 months, Eleanor took her first step. It was not a step so much as a shuddering, agonizing transfer of weight from the bed to the floor, supported entirely by Isaiah's strong arms. The effort left her drenched in sweat and trembling, but a wild, triumphant light blazed in her eyes. It was a victory not just over her body, but over the life of passive confinement she had been sentenced to. Isaiah, for the first time, allowed a small, brief smile to touch his lips. It was the smile of a craftsman who sees his work taking form, of a teacher whose student has grasped a fundamental lesson. The news of this milestone rippled through the plantation. Master Alistair allowed himself a rare, thin smile. The maids chattered about it in the kitchen, their superstitions about Isaiah's magic growing. But for Eleanor and Isaiah, it was a silent, shared revolution. She began to walk every day, her strides becoming more confident, her balance less precarious. The vast landscape of her body was being reshaped, not into society's ideal of slender beauty, but into a functional, living vessel. She lost a significant amount of weight, but more importantly, she gained strength, mobility, and a flicker of a future. With her newfound mobility came a new perspective. She began to venture onto the veranda, then into the garden, leaning on Isaiah's arm. Through his eyes, she began to see the plantation not as her beautiful, inherited home, but as an engine of brutality. She saw the weary lines on the faces of the field hands, the way they averted their eyes when she passed, the casual violence of the overseers. The beautiful songs of the slaves, which she had once found so quaint and melodic, now sounded to her like the laments they truly were. The world was being stripped of its gilding, revealing the rotten wood beneath. She started asking Isaiah questions about his life, about his family. At first, he was guarded, his answers curt and non-committal. But her curiosity was genuine, born from her own experience of being a prisoner, and slowly, carefully, he began to trust her with fragments of his truth. He spoke of his wife, sold away to a Georgia plantation when he was young. He spoke of the children he would never know. He did not speak with bitterness, but with a profound, enduring sorrow that shook Eleanor to her core. Her own suffering, which had felt so absolute, now seemed small and privileged in comparison. The dynamic was now dangerously balanced on a knife's edge. The master saw a daughter restored to a semblance of health, an asset protected. The daughter saw the man who had given her back her life, and in doing so, had opened her eyes to the horrific cost of that life. And the man, Isaiah, walked a tightrope, his success having made him indispensable but also having heightened his visibility and thus his vulnerability. He knew that Alistair's gratitude was a fickle thing, entirely conditional on his continued usefulness. One evening, as Isaiah was preparing to leave, Alistair stopped him. "The girl looks presentable," he said, his tone that of a man assessing livestock. "We will have guests from the city next month. It is important she can host them. You will ensure it." It was not a request. It was a reminder of the hierarchy, a reassertion of ownership over both the healer and the healed. Isaiah merely nodded, but the command felt like a cold hand on his heart. Eleanor was to be returned to her role as the plantation daughter, a living testament to her father's power, her transformation just another one of his possessions. Eleanor, overhearing this from the hallway, felt a hot surge of anger so foreign it startled her. The thought of parading her recovered body for her father's peers, of reducing Isaiah's profound work to a parlor trick, sickened her. For the first time, she felt a loyalty that superseded her loyalty to her family name. It was a loyalty to the truth, to the man who had saved her. The seed of rebellion, planted in the fertile soil of her healed body, began to sprout. She began to use her recovered strength for subversion. She would sneak food from the pantry, dried meats, hard cheeses, anything that would keep, and hide it in an old trunk in her room. She took a pair of her father's socks, then a shirt, small, insignificant items that would not be immediately missed. She did not have a clear plan, only a burning, desperate need to do something, to repay the debt she felt she owed. Isaiah noticed the change in her. He saw the new determination in her eyes, the way she now looked at her father with a critical, almost disdainful gaze. He saw the small, hidden stash of supplies she thought was secret. He said nothing, but a new caution entered his demeanor. Her gratitude was a beautiful, dangerous thing. A slave's freedom could not be gifted by a plantation daughter, no matter how well-intentioned. The world did not work that way. The tension in the house became a palpable thing. Master Alistair, sensing a shift in his daughter's attitude, attributed it to returning health and willfulness. He increased his surveillance of her, and by extension, of Isaiah. The casual cruelty he displayed towards the other slaves became more pronounced in Isaiah's presence, as if to constantly reaffirm the natural order of things. He would make Isaiah stand for hours while he deliberated on trivial matters, a petty demonstration of power designed to erode the dignity their shared project had built. One afternoon, a field hand, exhausted and dehydrated, collapsed and died in the cotton field. The overseer, enraged at the loss of a day's work, ordered the body to be left as a lesson. Eleanor saw it from her window and was violently ill. That evening, she confronted Isaiah, her voice shaking with rage and tears. "How can you be so calm? How can you bear this?" Isaiah looked at her, his eyes holding centuries of sorrow. "We bear it because we must," he said softly. "Anger is a fire that burns the one who holds it. We save our strength for the moments that matter." His words were a lesson in a different kind of strength, the strength of endurance, of silent, patient resistance. It was a strength Eleanor was only beginning to understand. She realized that his healing of her was an act of this very resistance, a quiet, profound insistence on life and dignity in a world designed to crush both. The day of the guests' arrival dawned hot and bright. The house was scrubbed, the silver polished, an air of forced festivity imposed upon the estate. Eleanor was dressed in a new gown, one that had to be taken insignificantly, a visible testament to her transformation. She stood in the parlor, a statue of resentment, while her father preened. When the guests arrived, they were full of compliments for Alistair on his daughter's remarkable recovery. They saw it as a medical curiosity, a testament to good Southern resilience. Throughout the evening, Eleanor played her part with a cold, detached perfection. She smiled, she made conversation, but her eyes constantly sought out Isaiah, who was made to serve drinks, another reminder of his place. She saw the way the guests looked through him, as if he were a piece of furniture. The hypocrisy of it all choked her. These people, who praised her health, would be the first to condemn the man who made it possible, simply for the color of his skin. The breaking point came when one of the guests, a portly man with a booming voice, slapped his knee and said, "See, Alistair. I told you all that girl needed was some discipline and a good, strong tonic. The laziness is just bred out of them." The table laughed. Eleanor's fork clattered onto her plate. The sound was like a gunshot in the room. All eyes turned to her. Her father's gaze was a warning. She stood up, her body trembling not with weakness, but with a fury she could no longer contain. "The laziness," she said, her voice clear and cutting. "You think this was a matter of discipline? You think a tonic did this?" She swept a hand down the length of her body. "I was dying. The doctors had given up. The man who saved me, the man who knows more about life and healing than all of you will ever know, is the same man you just ordered to fetch your brandy as if he were a dog." A stunned silence fell over the room. Master Alistair's face was a mask of thunderous fury. "Eleanor," he hissed, the word a venomous command. "Sit down." But she was beyond his commands. "No, father, I will not. Isaiah gave me back my life. And what is his reward? To remain in bondage, to be treated as less than nothing." She turned her gaze to the guests, her eyes blazing. "You enjoy the wealth this land produces. You enjoy the comfort these hands provide. But you are willfully blind to the humanity of the people who create it. You are the ones who are sick." The portly guest spluttered, his face turning purple. "Alistair, control your daughter. She has clearly been reading abolitionist tracts. Her mind is unwell." In that moment, the entire foundation of Eleanor's life shattered. She saw the truth with absolute clarity. She was not one of them anymore. She could never be one of them again. She looked at her father, at his cold, enraged eyes, and she knew there was no going back. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving a silence more deafening than any outburst. The consequences were immediate and severe. Eleanor was confined to her room, a virtual prisoner once more, though now her prison was one of punishment, not infirmity. Master Alistair, humiliated and enraged, needed a target for his wrath. He could not publicly punish his daughter for her hysterics, but he could, and would, punish the source of her corruption. Isaiah was taken at dawn. He did not struggle. He had known this was a possible ending from the very beginning. He was dragged to the whipping post in the center of the yard. The accusation was insubordination and poisoning the mind of the master's daughter. The lash, a cruel, braided leather whip, cracked in the morning air. Eleanor, from her window, watched in horror, her hands pressed against the glass, sobs racking her body. Each crack of the whip felt like it was splitting her own skin. She saw the stoic set of Isaiah's shoulders, the way he refused to cry out, absorbing the pain in silence, just as he had taught her to endure her own. It was not a punishment, it was an annihilation. It was meant to break not just his body, but his spirit, to erase the power he had wielded in the sickroom and re-establish the master's absolute dominion. With every strike, Alistair was trying to scour away the respect Eleanor held for him, to reduce him back to a bloody, broken piece of property. When it was over, Isaiah was cut down, his back a ruin of torn flesh. He was dragged back to the slave quarters, his life hanging by a thread. The other slaves tended to him in silence, their faces grim. The hope that had flickered among them was now extinguished, replaced by a familiar, weary despair. Eleanor was shattered. The body that Isaiah had so carefully rebuilt felt like a hollow shell. The strength he had given her now had no purpose, no outlet. She had tried to speak a truth, and the world had responded with unimaginable violence. She stopped eating. She refused to leave her room. The light that had returned to her eyes was gone, replaced by a bleak, bottomless grief. She had been given a taste of freedom, only to have the hand that offered it brutally severed. Weeks passed. The marks on Isaiah's back slowly healed into thick, ropey scars, a permanent map of the price of knowledge and compassion. He was sent back to the fields, his work as a healer finished. He moved with a new stiffness, a permanent reminder of his punishment. He and Eleanor never spoke again. They would sometimes see each other at a distance, her on the veranda, him returning from the fields, and their eyes would meet for a fleeting second, a silent exchange of everything that had been lost, everything that could never be. The plantation settled back into its brutal rhythm. The grand house was quiet once more. Master Alistair had restored order, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. His daughter was a ghost, a living monument to his own failure. The most valuable slave on his property was broken in spirit, his greatest skill now a dangerous memory. Eleanor's body, once the site of such intense and hopeful activity, began to slowly decline again. Without the purpose Isaiah's care had given it, without the will to maintain it, the old lethargy began to creep back. She did not return to her former immensity, but she shrank in a different way, becoming thin and frail, her health eroded from the inside out by grief and guilt. Isaiah worked under the sun, his body performing the motions of labor, but his mind was elsewhere. He remembered the feel of her pulse strengthening under his fingers, the moment she took her first step, the brilliant, defiant light in her eyes during her speech at the dinner table. He had done his work too well. He had not just healed a body, he had awakened a conscience, and in that world, a conscience was a fatal disease. The story of the plantation owner's obese daughter and the slave who healed her became a whispered legend, a dark folktale passed down. It was a story with no happy ending, no triumphant moral. It was a story about the collision of two worlds, about the impossible fragility of human connection in a system built on its destruction. The slave had reshaped the daughter's body, and in doing so, had reshaped her soul, leaving them both stranded in a limbo between the lives they were born into and the truth they had glimpsed together, a truth that, in the end, their world was not yet ready to bear. The 100th paragraph finds the air on the plantation still thick, but now it is thick with the dust of regret and the ghosts of what might have been, a silence more profound than any that came before, broken only by the endless, sighing wind. Through the cotton fields,